Thank you, Ms. Lynch, so much for being here.
Saraya, I am delighted to be here with you and with WGBH.
Excellent. I want to jump right in. Right now, one of our local scholars, Larry Tribe, has told GBH News he sees no way that former President Donald Trump escapes jail time. And former U.S. District Judge Nancy Gertner expects Trump to be indicted. Do you also consider Trump's indictment a foregone conclusion? And do you think the fact that he still enjoys arguably a lot of political support will mitigate any outcome of any case?
So Professor Tribe is my former professor. And he certainly is learned, and he's seen a number of these things. Obviously, Judge Gertner, very experienced. What I can tell you is that as a former prosecutor, the way that you handle these cases is by doing a careful and thorough review of all the evidence, all the facts, and then applying the law to those facts. So I will tell you that I think the prosecutors in the room would tell you that it's too early to make that determination, but what's happening right now in the Department of Justice is a review of everything. And there are things that have been made public. I guarantee you there's things behind the scene that are being explored as well that won't be discussed publicly, that will weigh heavily on those decisions. What you want is a process that takes everything into consideration, and frankly the fact that there's political popularity or even unpopularity is not the determining factor in the resolution of a case.
And have you given any thought to whether or not, if you were still sitting in the seat, you would prosecute Trump?
So if I were still sitting in the seat, I'd be doing what AG Garland is doing now, which is building cases against everyone involved in, for example, January 6th, the insurrection that almost took down our democracy. So far, over 900 people charged. But I'd also be looking very carefully at the causes and the instigators of that insurrection, and we've seen him do that. So I feel confident that that's going on. I'd also be looking at any case that touched on anybody who may need to be held accountable for that. But it would be with a view towards making sure that I had all the facts, all the evidence, and then apply the law to those facts and make the decision based on that. And I can tell you that, when you're in that chair, you do hear the buzz of commentators, the buzz of pundits. You have to push it aside. It does not weigh on him the way it does on those people who are listening to us today, because his focus is what his team is bringing to him.
I'm so glad you mentioned January 6th. Here in Massachusetts, we've had 8 people arrested in connection with their attendance at the riot there. And according to the latest listings from the U.S. Department of Justice, the last person to be sentenced initially faced 5 charges. They struck a deal, they pleaded guilty to 1, and I think they got 36 months probation and $500 in a restitution charge, and then like a $2,500 fine. I just wonder, as the nation's former chief law enforcement officer, have you had any concern about people getting light sentences for their participation, given that January 6th was what it was?
It was an armed insurrection, frankly. I mean, to think that we would ever see the Confederate flag flying in the U.S. Capitol was just a travesty. But whenever you have large groups of individuals involved in violent behavior, one of the things you try and do is look and see who's more culpable than the next person, and you try and have proportional sentencing. I haven't seen those specific cases, but there have been some people who've actually gotten some fairly stiff jail sentences out of their behavior in January 6th. And the thing to do is to compare their actions to those people who are getting different sentences.
And Stewart Rhodes, you think he should be charged with something more harsh, like sedition rather than seditious conspiracy?
Well, seditious conspiracy is pretty harsh. It's a rare charge, and frankly it should be rare, because we don't like to think that there are citizens who are essentially committing treason against our country. But the fact that it's rare and the fact that it requires a great deal of work to pull together, I think shows you how committed this Department of Justice is to following the facts and the law wherever they take them and bringing the most appropriate charge. This fits. This is exactly what the Oath Keepers were trying to do. A conspiracy, a criminal agreement to basically bring down the government. There's really nothing more serious than that.
I want to revisit a really tough part of your time as Attorney General, particularly because we're seeing a rise in white supremacist organizing in Massachusetts. Dylan Roof, the man who carried out that mass shooting against a Bible study group at the church in South Carolina,
Yes.
Mother Emanuel AME, while you were sitting. Did you have any reaction yesterday to the U.S. Supreme Court rejecting his appeal for looking again at his sentence and conviction?
I thought that it was appropriate. This was a case that was handled with extreme care and concern. We were determined to essentially look at everything and make sure that we brought all the appropriate evidence to bear, but also that we heard from the defendant and we let him make whatever mitigating statements he could make. It was, as you know, a very emotional case, particularly with regards to whether the death penalty should be sought. And it was one of those rare cases where it ended up falling in that category.
Sticking with sort of the Supreme Court a little bit and looking back at your nomination in 2016, from where we sit now and with what we know now, I was saying to you earlier, I think it's amazing to be sitting here with you thinking that you were the first Black woman Attorney General in the United States and that you might have been the first Black woman to the U.S. Supreme Court, but you withdrew your nomination. Do you, looking back at it, have any change of heart about
I think
the withdrawal?
right person is in that seat at the exact right time. And if anyone saw Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson and heard her discussion in the argument, her very first seating, then you know that she's not only a force of nature, a force of intellect, but she's a force of reason. And she's what the court needs at this very, very difficult time. Someone to hold up a mirror to people who are, for whatever reason, going back to these outdated theories of conservative judicial ideology and trying to make them fit the facts of today when they never fit the facts of 200 years ago. So she's the perfect person for this. And I will tell you that I would not have traded my time as Attorney General for any other position.
Wow. And how do you think you'd respond if a spot opened up and you were nominated again?
Well, that's up to the president, of course. And I think they've got a lot of people who, again, would be so perfect for that position, particularly in the voice of reason and the voice of pushing forward ideas of progress and equality that now is going to be more important than ever. I look at Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson really as this generation's Thurgood Marshall.
Wow.
He was often in the minority.
That's heavy.
He was often in the dissent, but his voice still speaks loud today. He foresaw so many of these issues on reproductive rights, for example. He talked about what would happen if, in fact, a woman's right to choose was curtailed. When it happened, as it did in fits and starts, he talked about the societal upheaval and the challenges to poor women, to women of color, the disregard for women's ability to make their own decisions and reason. He talked about everything that we're seeing now. So I think she's in that chair. She's in that chair and she's exactly where she needs to be.
Immigration, another controversial topic as you were approaching the seat under President Barack Obama. I'm sure you know last month a group of about 50 migrants was dropped off at Martha's Vineyard, kind of making Massachusetts ground zero for the next phase of the political fight on immigration. I wonder, Madam Attorney General, some people will say that they can see a line from your time sitting in the seat to now that Republicans are kind of focused on immigration as a campaign issue. Thinking back, do you feel any kind of responsibility because you didn't denounce the president's executive action? This was a huge thing, again, during your confirmation hearing.
So the president's executive action during my confirmation hearing was essentially about DACA, and it was called DAPA at the time, which was trying to provide a safe haven for the hardworking people who had been in the country, living and supporting our economy for so many years. I think that, when I look back at that time, I think what's the most challenging thing that I remember is that we were so close to bipartisan immigration reform in the Senate. And this is people from across the aisle who worked incredibly hard to try and make these issues come together and provide not just a safe haven for the DACA recipients, but a path to citizenship for deserving individuals, and then to have it fall apart in the House. And from that point on, we don't seem to have been able to get that similar congressional momentum going. And clearly it's there. There are people who've thought about this issue on both sides of the aisle and came together at one time to come up with some practical, real-world solutions to this problem. And when you don't have that sort of leadership in terms of legislative authority, Presidents will take executive action because they're trying to move the needle forward. They're trying to get things done. But the door is still open. The door is always, certainly during the Obama administration, the door remained open for comprehensive immigration reform. There just was no one who wanted to walk through it anymore. And I think one of the tragedies of our country is that this divisiveness that has infected every issue has kept people apart on the issue of immigration as well.
I want to turn to your thoughts on more recent events now. What went through your mind as you watched people kind of take to the streets in 2020 over the issues of police brutality and racism? I'm thinking about Freddie Gray and that being your kind of trial by fire when you were coming on as Attorney General.
My first day as Attorney General was the day of Freddie Gray's funeral and the day that violence broke out in Baltimore. It was the first case that I briefed the president on, where those issues and police reform and so many of the things that we had talked about before I was able to take office. So when I saw 2020 and the reaction to the death of George Floyd, obviously I was heartbroken like everyone else, and really had that moment of discouragement about where was police reform going. But I have to say, I soon became very heartened because the movement and the opposition spread beyond just people directly impacted by Mr. Floyd's death. And we saw people across the country and across the world recognizing the systemic issues that had led George Floyd to find his way under that police officer's knee. And it was a recognition that we really had not seen, I would say, since the civil rights movement in the 60s. It was national, it was international. There were people who had never focused on this issue before, who were marching in solidarity with people who were trying to uplift Mr. Floyd's life. And that, frankly, gave, and it still gives me a great deal of hope. I think that people will come together and continue to work on these difficult issues. And they're hard, but you do it on a community-wide basis. You go right to the communities that are struggling, and you find ways to build those bridges of communication between community members and law enforcement. And I've seen that done. We tried to uplift and make examples of situations in communities where it was happening when I was in office. And they were often places that had been through terrible tragedies, like Minnesota, for example. And they had worked, and they had really, frankly, pulled their way back from the abyss, and they had to keep at it. You have to have the tough conversations. You have to focus on the pain that these situations cause, and you have to have acknowledgement on both sides of the humanity on the other side.
Do you think America is in a better spot on that front now?
I think we ebb and flow. I think we ebb and flow on that spot. I think we saw great progress after Mr. Floyd's murder. I think we saw an awakening at an individual and institutional level that has begun to push the needle forward. I think now we are seeing people who are trying to send us backwards. And this happens every time. Whenever there's progress, you're going to get a backlash to that. Whenever you see efforts that really do work and really advance equality, you see someone rising up and saying, oh, no, more equality for you is less for me. It's not pie, right? There's enough for everyone. So we see that now too. But what that tells me is, frankly, the real change is being made, or there wouldn't be this fierce opposition to it.
I want to ask you, one of the results of those protests, like you said, was a new kind of widespread focus on racial equity, and you are now leading the Paul Weiss firm's Racial Equity and Civil Rights Audit Division, and one of your first tasks has been to review Amazon's policies that affect its hourly workforce. I think I read somewhere that the result of that work will be public. Can you share anything about where you are with that work and when we can expect to see results?
Well, we can't share anything now because it's still ongoing, and so obviously not able to go into that. But what I can say is it's a very important aspect of my practice. We try and help a number of people with the challenges of diversity and equity and inclusion in a number of ways. And one of the things that happened after George Floyd's murder was companies who were beefing up their diversity and equity and inclusion practices were looking for assistance there. We provide that. But also, stakeholders in this process, customers, employees, community members, shareholders, began to turn to companies and say, tell us how your programs are doing. Are you really having an impact? So we're helping a number of companies really assess the impact of so much of the work they've been doing over the past few years. And that's an important part of continuing that work and pushing that work forward.
I want to end on a light note here and just ask you, in 2020, when we were all hunkered down in quarantine, where were you and what were you doing to pass the time? I know some people baked bread and took up hiking and learned a new language. What did you do?
I was back in New York. I was back in New York after my time in Washington, settling into my home and my practice. And frankly, honestly, I was most of the time glued to the TV watching the protests and cheering those young people on who were lifting their voices and making their concerns heard and watching them push our institutions toward real change. It's a hard thing to do, even when they want to do the right thing. You know, inertia sets in. It can be difficult to make change. But I was watching that change happen, and I was so proud of them. I was so incredibly proud of their energy and their effort and their commitment.
Former U.S. Attorney General Loretta Lynch, thank you so much.
Thank you, Saraya.